Death Trash may be one of the grossest games I've ever played. And I just played Darkest Dungeon too. There's these weird flesh krakens, meat just grows from the ground, there's a dedicated puke button, but in that grossness breeds curiosity, as I just couldn't help but explore the world looking for answers, and aided by a fun combat system, I left my time with the game eager for more. After a brief introduction where your character is kicked out of an underground base by some robotic caretakers with only a brief explanation of you're infected with something, implying the game is set in America because all the apocalypse means for Big Pharma is ooh, more money. After that, the game just throws you out into the strange world and says, go, figure it out. I just love when open world games do this. Open world games have always had a problem telling a more traditional story because whenever you had that big dramatic cutscene where the main character just has to get to this location and stop the bad guys right now or the world will end, and then we cut back the gameplay and you spend 5 hours fishing. That type of storytelling just doesn't work that well with open world games. It works much better when the game gives you kind of a vague goal like explore the solar system in Outer Wilds, or find the guy that tried to kill you in Fallout New Vegas. Those more vague or smaller personal stories just tend to work better in an open world format, because ironically it allows you to just ignore them if you want to and just explore the world, which is where this genre's best strength is at, while still sort of guiding you throughout the world. That's what Death Trash does. You're infected with something, you should probably get on that and figure it out, but if you want to just play like you got American health insurance and ignore it and go about your day and hope it just goes away, you can do that too. Instead, help the giant flesh Cthulhu growing out the side of a mountain find some new friends. Yeah, that probably needs some explanation, huh? So let's talk about the world building a bit. To put it simply, shit's fucking weird. It starts off feeling a lot like a Fallout game with you waking up in an underground base and then you leave to find an apocalyptic world, but this world just has flesh growing out of the ground and people subsist off of that meat, and there's mutants running around and ancient eldritch gods exist. I think there's a statue of a founder of the first town you go to and they're clearly a mutant but no one acknowledges it. Apparently it does, or at least used to rain that same meat that grows from the ground. There's no real explanation for any of this in the game, at least not yet, or at least not that I could find, and if there was it'd probably be spoilers anyways, but the world is just so weird and fascinating and unique, as gross as it all is. I found myself engrossed in it, and I'm very much looking forward to learning more as the game develops and as they add in new content. But I would have liked to see some more environmental variety in the game. It's mostly desert with just meat spewing from the ground, which is an interesting aesthetic. It's striking, it's unique, and it immediately hooks you into the world and makes you want to just figure out what the heck happened to this world. And the pixel art style is used pretty cleverly when you think about it to make some of the more gruesome imagery more palatable. There's technically a lot of very disturbing imagery in this game, with giant corpses and lakes of blood and meat octopuses in the sides of mountains, stuff that would normally be far too gruesome, almost comically so if it were rendered in a more realistic art style. And if it were using a more realistic art style, it would probably blend in with the ocean of edgy horror games on Steam right now. But the 8-bit pixel art makes it palatable and makes it feel more unique and allows it to both get some of the more gruesome imagery in and still get some of its quirkier aspects through, like the random nudists that are just dancing around the environment and just all of the oddball, probably clinically insane people that populate this world through without messing with this game's tone in any way. It's probably the only world where I can go from talking with a giant man crying tears of blood into a lake of blood that he's submerged in as he tells me about someone going around killing eldritch gods and then go help someone win a puking competition without getting tonal whiplash. All of it just feels like a natural part of this strange world. And the game is open world, but it's an indie game, as you could probably tell from the art style. They can't do a massive open world filled to the brim with stuff like Elden Ring or a Ubisoft game, but they obviously want to have you explore the strange kind of gross world, so they meet us halfway. Instead of a big world to explore, we get this overworld map, with points of interest that are uncovered either through quests or just by exploring it. And once you get to those locations, they are open. They're big enough that you can explore them a little bit. You can select the destination on the overworld and your character will just automatically travel there, but you can also just pick a random spot in the Fog of War and your character will go there too. And there are hidden locations to find on the map. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, you don't really get that feeling of going on a grand adventure where you're scaling mountains and wading through dangerous swamps because of all that adventuring is kind of done off screen. But this means we get to the actual interesting stuff in the world much faster. It's always been a problem in open world games where you end up spending more time traveling to a point of interest than actually doing the interesting thing that's there, but here we still get that satisfaction of exploring and uncovering a map, but we also get to the fun stuff fairly quickly. And it's not like the areas like the dungeons and towns and stuff aren't expansive in and of themselves, they are. Some of those areas get pretty big actually, and there are plenty of goodies hidden in every nook and cranny too. The maps we do get to run around in range from more open areas to labyrinthine corridors packed with enemies, and they were all pretty interesting to explore, even if a lot of the things we were finding were just crafting materials. It still felt rewarding. They found a good balance of making areas open enough that it felt like I was exploring an open area, but small enough that there was always something interesting around the corner, either a fight or some loot or bits of lore. I played the game for around 8 to 9 hours before it ended, quote unquote. The game cost $22 Canadian, which will be about 15-ish US. Whether or not that's worth the cost is up to you, but it's important to note I still had about 2/3 of the map left to explore that still had some areas with side quests and even hidden bosses that were really fun to fight actually. But you can still feel a bit of that early accessness in that there's not a ton of content, and some of these optional areas just didn't quite feel finished. Like, some just don't have much there, or anything at all in some cases. Like, there was this one area with a lake and a small building, and there was just nothing there. I don't know if there was a quest that I missed that had something to do with that area, or if it's an Easter egg that's going way over my head, or what, but most of the areas I was discovering did have something there that was worth your time, like loot or those cool bosses I mentioned earlier, which I do hope they add more of later on, because it was really cool to just stumble across these giant enemies and be like, oh crap, I guess I'm fighting this thing now. Death Trash is an RPG, but didn't really feel like my choices were affecting very much, which is what I kind of look for in Western RPGs in particular. Like, you have a stat called Empathy, which is this game's version of speech or charisma, but I didn't get many options to use empathy, period, and the few times I did, it didn't feel like it did too much. Like, there was this one side mission where some guy was depressed and you can use empathy to cheer him up, or instead, if you don't have a lot of empathy, you can just talk to a random person in the bar and get them to like flirt with him instead. Using empathy didn't change much though, at least it didn't feel like it. And moments like that where I had empathy as an option were few and far between, at least in the game as it is now. But this could be chalked up to the game just being in early access, and maybe later on we'll see the consequences to our actions, because it does feel like there is a big portion of the game that just isn't out yet, but I feel like the game's focusing more on the combat and improving your stats and gear and stuff like that more so than expansive dialogue trees. And the combat is fun. It plays like an isometric hack and slash shooter reminiscent of classic RPGs of old, but much faster. When I was initially building my character, I was worried about like, oh, should I focus on guns because they're probably really powerful, but how rare will ammo will be. Maybe I should stick with melee instead, but very quickly I realized that you actually need both. Ammo is rare, and for most of the game I was scrounging for ammo or materials to craft it. This often meant I was switching between different types of guns to one I had ammo for. So the rifle was my main weapon for its range and power, but once ammo for that was starting to run low, I would swap out to the shotgun and then maybe an energy weapon if ammo was low on the other two. But mostly I would stick with melee if I could in order to preserve ammo, which did get me killed more than once, or twice, or 3 times. I am nothing if not stubborn. So even though the combat on the surface seems simple, because it kind of is to be honest, I was regularly swapping out the different weapons and playstyles, going from sniping people from afar with the rifle to closing the gap and turning my enemies to bloody pulp. That kind of just looked like the environment now that I think about it, with the shotgun or dancing around the enemies with melee. You need both melee and range, especially early on in this game where ammo is very rare. You can't just be a gunslinger or just a brute with a club, you kind of need both. It wasn't until near the end of the game where I had an abundance of ammo or the resources to craft it, and even then I was still swapping to melee or my shotgun now and then. You will end up spending a lot of time flipping through your inventory though. There's a healthy amount of inventory management in this game. Inventory management is one of those things that I'm at least becoming more critical of as more and more games add in gear and RPG mechanics, and not always well to be honest, but I don't mind inventory management to an extent. It can be a good way to break up combat, for example, preventing it from getting too repetitive and giving the player a chance to rest and recover, and that's what Death Trash's inventory management feels like. You technically have 2 inventory sections, one for your crafting materials and one for gear, healing items, etc. That's the one you're going to be looking at all the time. Inventory space is pretty limited and there's no way to increase it, so sometimes you do have to make some difficult choices as to what you want to keep or toss. Do you want that extra healing stack for emergencies, or would you rather go for the ammo instead? Neither choice is right or wrong, but it is a choice you're going to have to make now and then, which is what kept the inventory management at least somewhat interesting to me. I think that's where a lot of inventory managements kind of fail in a lot of games, when it's just being like filled up with gear and junk you're just never going to use, but you gotta look in your inventory anyways just in case there's something useful in there, and then you gotta trash all the rest, and it just feels like a big waste of time. But everything in Death Trash at least felt somewhat useful in one way or another, but they could still cut down on it a little bit. For example, there are these items that just give you XP when you use them, which are great and really fun to find, but you have to go into a menu, select the item, and then use it. It'd be nice to just see an option where when I find one of those things on the ground, instead of adding it to my inventory and doing all of that, I could just, I don't know, hold down X or something and use it right there, skipping all of the menus. Because there's no reason not to use them. If I'm picking up an item that's going to give me XP, I'm going to use it right away, especially if it's sucking up a valuable inventory slot. The same could be said for breaking down weapons for crafting materials. Again, you have to add it to your inventory, and then you have to go through a few menus to break it down. Again, it'd be nice if I could just stand over the item when it's laying on the ground, hold down a button, just automatically break it down, and skip all of that. It'd just be nice quality of life improvement that would keep the game from slowing down too much. But like I said, it does serve as a bit of a break from combat, which is nice, especially since the combat has a bit of a bite to it. I wouldn't call it super challenging or incredibly difficult, especially after I swap from mouse and keyboard to controller. Look, PC Master Race. I love my mouse and keyboard, they've served me well, but you gotta admit, sometimes controller is just better for some games, and this is one of them, but the game does have a challenge to it. Enemies are not afraid to gang up on you, and you often have groups of enemies that have a mixture of both melee and ranged units, meaning if you're trying to use a melee to deal with another melee enemy to conserve ammo, that can make you a very easy target for their buddy who's rocking a rifle, and enemies can hit pretty hard too. I did find myself having to think to be careful and take my time when fighting and make sure not to get greedy, to be patient and know when to move in for the melee or pull back and start shooting. And luckily, switching between melee and range is so fluid, you almost don't notice it, which is great. You got one of the face buttons tied to melee, the trigger for shooting, analog stick for aiming, and that's it. And it just automatically and instantly switches to melee or range depending on the button you pressed. There's no waiting for a lengthy animation to switch or anything, so long as you have something equipped in that slot, you're golden. This meant that once I got the hang of the combat, I was swapping back and forth from range to melee mid-battle in a way that felt fast and frantic, but never too much so. It always felt like I was in control, or I could be in control if I was, you know, good at the game. I would have liked to see more weapons and stuff though. I built my character to use bladed weapons and two-handed guns like rifles and shotguns. I started with an old rifle and eventually upgraded to a regular rifle fairly early on, and I stuck with that for most of my playtime. It was a similar story with the shotgun, one upgrade and I was good, and I think I used the same sword throughout the whole game. There are plenty of different categories of weapons, but I put all my stats into two-handed weapons and bladed weapons, so I didn't really feel like I could switch. I certainly don't expect the game to suddenly become Diablo or something, but hopefully as they add in more content and presumably new areas to explore, I hope they add in a couple more tiers of weapons for each category. There are also weapon mods you can get, but they're about what you expect. You can have one per weapon, they can increase damage, reduce reload time, and stuff like that. They were cool, but maybe later on they can add in some more out there mods and weapons, you know, there's a dedicated puke button in this game. Maybe we can make I don't know, a gun that shoots puke or something. I don't know, why not? Lean into the ridiculousness and grossness of the game. But even when the game is at its most challenging, it never feels too punishing, because the game saves pretty much every time you go into a new area, so you just end up respawning at the beginning of that area. It does still suck when you have to deal with a difficult group of enemies only to get offed in your weakened state by another nearby group, which is why you're seeing my character stop a lot, and if you're paying attention you'll probably notice the little saving thing in the corner. I'll save scum. I'm not afraid to admit it. I'm proud of my save scumming. Rise up, save scummers. We are here and scummy. And in desperate need of a better slogan. But my point is, you never get sent back too far. You never lose too much progress, like in some other, often older RPGs. I think the best indicator of whether an early access game will be good or not is when they have the gameplay loop nailed and it just needs more content. Death Trash has a great gameplay loop in a world that just begs to be explored. It just needs more. I was genuinely disappointed when I reached the end because I was so hooked into that world, so much so that I proceeded to explore the rest of the map, to mine it for any remaining bit of content. And I did that because I wanted to, because I enjoyed it, not because there were daily challenges or anything. No, I just really enjoyed the game and wanted more. When the biggest criticism of your game is that people wish there was more of it, that's a really good place to be, because all my other criticisms are fairly minor. I'd be totally fine if they just added in more content and that was it. Heck, even if they don't, I'm happy with the time I spent with the game. They need to add a narrative end to it, but I don't need every game to be 100 hours long or anything. I think Death Trash is worth the price of admission right now. Just keep in mind it's still a shorter experience, but I just can't wait to explore more of the strange and fascinating world of Death Trash. It would also be strange and fascinating if you hit that subscribe button, or like the video for more indie and early access reviews. I guess that's what I'm doing now. I think these outros are getting worse, actually. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you made it to the end of this, thank you, and have a good one.